Whether we live in the jungle or the concrete jungle, we've all had interactions with animals. And animals are a part of what makes us human. This social framing governs our perceptions of them, whether it's a beloved domesticated pet or the big bad wolf of Little Red Riding Hood fame. But whether or not people tolerate living close to wildlife depends on how humans, as individuals or communities, define wildlife spaces versus human spaces. And as wildlife spaces continue to decline and human settlements continue to expand, those definitions will become more thorny than ever, and that question more and more difficult to answer. Now, human-human diplomacy is very important, the ability to step into someone else's shoes, to really understand where they're coming from. But as we continue to cross these interspecies boundaries, we'll have to consider the needs of our fur, feather, and scale-bearing neighbors as well. And this brings me to something that I like to call interspecies diplomacy. Interspecies diplomacy, as I characterize it, is a consideration of wildlife needs, while not discounting the very real impact that wildlife can have on human populations and vice versa. But how is this all relevant to you? You might be saying to yourself, I don't live directly with wildlife. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I study human-wildlife coexistence issues in the Kalahari Desert of a southern African country called Botswana. And like many of us, I grew up on wildlife documentaries, and I thought of wildlife as something exotic, something out there, something that I would have to leave home to find. And it wasn't until I dug further and further into my career that I really realized wildlife is all around us. You yourselves likely had a human-wildlife interaction, probably pretty close to home, whether it was admiring a bird at a bird feeder, brushing some ants off a picnic blanket, or if you're like me in Wisconsin, crossing your fingers really hard that a white-tailed deer isn't about to run across the road right in front of you. It all depends on how we define wildlife and opening up that definition of what we consider wildlife. The grasshopper that buzzed out of the grass when you're walking across the yard on the way to work, that's wildlife. Those pigeons that you saw strutting around that bus station, hey, that's wildlife. And interactions with wildlife can be positive, neutral, or negative. Let's go back to that deer example for a moment. According to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, there are 15,000 to 19,000 deer-related vehicular incidents per year just within the state of Wisconsin. That is up to 19,000 per year just in one state. That's a lot of indirect, negative human-wildlife interactions. But what about more direct, negative human-wildlife interactions? Something where the animal might have a little bit more agency in how it chooses to engage with people. In my field, direct, negative human-wildlife interactions are often termed human-wildlife conflict. A good example of human-wildlife conflict in the state of Wisconsin is wolf-livestock conflict. Occasionally, wolves may eat farmers' livestock or be perceived to be a threat to farmers' livestock, and farmers may retaliate against the wolves, either at an individual or a population level, sometimes fatally. And this really is a lose-lose situation for people and wildlife. For the wildlife that's just trying to survive, and for people who are trying to protect their interests. You know, it's funny, as a conservation biologist, I took a lot of classes. But they never really taught me a lot about the different wildlife that we may have human-wildlife interactions with. Importantly, human-wildlife conflict happens all over the world, not just within the state of Wisconsin. And it's not always with the species that you would first expect. When I was recently working in Botswana, we as researchers had a human-wildlife conflict, but it wasn't with a lion, or a leopard, or an African wild dog, or even a cheetah. It was with 2 Cape porcupines. Now, these porcupines would break into our staff kitchen every single night. They would try to get into our food. They would strew flour all over the floor. And if they couldn't get into our food, they would try to chew up the cardboard boxes, they would chew on the table, and they'd basically act like a bunch of rock stars in the hotel room. It wasn't just the kitchen, though. One time I was going into the staff office to try to print something out for this very TED Talk, and those porcupine had strewn printer paper all over the floor. They had even chewed it up in some places into some kind of rage confetti. Needless to say, I did not print anything that day. Now this story has a happy ending. We were able to safely live trap these porcupine and translocate them away from camp, and they didn't come back. But it shows human-wildlife conflict can happen with any species. And like I mentioned, I took so many different classes in wildlife dynamics and animal behavior and statistics and geographic information systems. But where's my class on people? Where's my crash course on working with people? Never had it, even though it's 90% of what I work with, and the most important tool in my toolkit is empathy. As conservation biologists, a lot of us get into this field because we love wildlife and we want to conserve wildlife. But in order for conservation practitioners to be truly effective, wildlife people need to become people. In my years working in both Eastern and Southern Africa, I have learned that there is no true conservation without people, and to go further, without not just the inclusion, but the centering of communities that live alongside wildlife. There are many different reasons for this, but one of the major ones is, as an outside researcher, it's easy to miss the nuance that underpins wildlife issues. For example, an outside researcher might go into the community, and they might see the problem. They might say, okay, jackals are eating goats. If I stop the jackals from eating the goats, people will like jackals more. They won't want to extirpate them. Win-win, everyone's happy. That was easy, right? But there may be many different factors, either current or historic or both, that underpin how people might feel about conservation issues. There might be many different interest groups in communities that have very different opinions on what should be done with wildlife. Or these wildlife issues may just be symptomatic of deeper community strife that as outside researchers, we may or may not be privy to. Now, as conservation biologists, a lot of us like to think of ourselves as neutral, objective. We like science, right? When in fact, we all approach our work with our own biases and our own agendas. Many conservation biologists, not all, but many, do not live directly with wildlife and have to deal with any of the potential negative ramifications of living with wildlife. It's very easy to love wildlife and to want to conserve wildlife if you yourself are not dealing with any of those potential negative impacts of living close to wildlife. No one likes to feel like conservation is happening to them, or like their needs are less important than that of wildlife. And there's so many different reasons that people might react differently to conservation issues. For instance, in the past, some people had been moved from their land, often against their will, to then open up that land for conservation. Something like this can have massive impacts on how people view conservation and conservation issues, even generationally. Or there might be issues with something like a compensation policy. Maybe there's a compensation policy in place to try to pay people if they lose their crops or their livestock to animals, but those payouts may or may not happen in a timely fashion. And even if they do, it's unlikely to be for the full market amount of what was lost, and this can lead to financial hardship. It's hard to internalize the message that wildlife belongs to you and that you should conserve it. There's so much other messaging, either overt or covert, that seems to suggest otherwise. And this is why leading with empathy in conservation is so incredibly important. Empathy is the ability to understand another person's internal state, to really try to understand their perspectives. I'm going to share an anecdote of approaching a conservation issue through the lens of empathy. So I was working in Kavango West, in one of the regions of Namibia very close to the Angolan border. And I was working with a small team, and we were talking to a lot of different farmers in the area. And they were having, some issues with wildlife. They had jackals eating their goats and leopards eating their calves. And we were speaking to a lot of these different farmers, and one of them was very candid with us. He said, "I just can't take it anymore. I'm just going to shoot all these jackals and shoot all these leopards, and that'll fix the problem. I just can't." And as a conservation biologist, I'm wearing a cheetah on my shirt. There's many different ways I could have reacted to that. I could have said, "No, you can't shoot the jackals, you can't shoot the leopards. Don't you know how important they are for the ecosystem?" I could have said, "It's unethical to shoot the jackals or the leopards. They're trying to survive, just like you." But I didn't. What I did is I really slowed down, and I tried to put aside those biases, and I tried to listen to what this person was telling me. He was anxious, he was concerned about his ability to provide for his family, for sustainability of his livelihood. And then I took a step back and I kind of leaned a little on the science, which I like to do, and I said, you could shoot those jackals, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that jackals will actually breed faster when they're being extirpated. So you may end up with more jackals than you had before, and that could potentially have a negative impact on your livestock. You could shoot that leopard, but that's a leopard a leopard that you might be able to guess the behavior at by shooting that leopard. That could potentially open up a power vacuum for 2 or 3 other leopards fighting over territory, which could potentially lead to negative impacts on your livestock. It's very hard to be able to anticipate what the removal of different animals may have on the ecosystem and on potential human-wildlife conflict. Now, he was really concerned about the potential ramifications of that. So we were able to sit down and talk about those concerns and come up with potential non-lethal methods to protect his livestock without having to harm the carnivores to do it. As a multiracial LGBTQIA scientist who also has a physical disability from childhood cancer, I've been incredibly lucky to have been brought up in a variety of different perspectives, a variety of different backgrounds, to become really comfortable with living in that gray area without definition. And I believe that it is this open-mindedness that has really helped me become an effective conservation practitioner. I also believe that this open-mindedness can be an incredible tool for conservation. I work with something called technical deterrence a lot of the time, and these are usually engineering devices that are deployed to try to scare large herbivores away from crops or carnivores away from livestock. And they're tech, right? They usually come from outside the country in which I'm working. But it's really important for us as researchers to not think that just because they're called technical deterrents, they're better necessarily than traditional ecological knowledge. People who live with wildlife have a tendency to know how to live with that wildlife. And there were many different techniques that potentially they had passed down through generations or came with themselves or with communities that are incredibly effective and that just might not have made it out into the scientific literature yet. African conservation issues belong in the hands of Africans. As outside researchers, we can play a supportive role, but it really belongs in the hands of Africans, and to go a step further, in the hands of the people who live directly with that wildlife. I'm going to share a moment from very early in my career that has always remained with me. It's from one of my very first gigs in Kenya, and I was speaking to this esteemed Kenyan conservationist. And he said, you outside researchers, you always like to tell Africans how to conserve our wildlife. But where's your equivalent of something like elephants or lions that people actively live nearby? How many people in your country live with something like an elephant? I didn't have a really good answer for that. In conservation biology, in human-wildlife conflict mitigation, everything has to be extremely context-specific. It has to be targeted for the place, for the community, for the people, even down to the individual level of whom you're working with. A continent is not a country. A country is not a region. A region is not a community is not a household, and a household is not an individual. There may be transferable lessons that can be, taught from place to place, but everything needs to fit within the context of where you're working. Even down to the individual level. An individual might have different histories, might have different perceptions of wildlife, might have different personalities that impact how they think about different conservation initiatives, might have their own ideas. And that's why no more including, but centering those communities, centering those individuals, and working hand in hand with them is so critically important. Now I call upon all conservation biologists to be excellent interspecies diplomats, to really dig into these issues of human-wildlife coexistence. But I also call upon all of you, anyone in the audience, anyone who is watching this, you too can bring those concepts of interspecies diplomacy into your daily life. Because as we saw earlier in this talk, wildlife really is all around us, if we just look around us. And this is going to become even more relevant as our changing world brings humans and wildlife into closer and closer proximity together. Human-wildlife coexistence is possible. But until there is active consideration of both animal and people needs, coexistence as a dynamic but sustainable state will always remain out of reach.